All right, so it's starting to slow down a little bit. So first of all, I'll say welcome. We've got two folks from the FAA here. This is our Think Autonomy podcast from Northland Community and Technical College and the National Center of Autonomous Technologies. We're also with the FAA UAS CTI, the Collegiate Training Initiative. And so they were nice enough to get two folks from the FAA to talk about remote ID, ops over people, and night operations here. So with me, I've got Ann Cihon. She's the program manager for RID integration, the remote ID integration. And then we've got Rick May, an engineer working in the UAS integration office at the FAA. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to our panelists. And we'll go ahead and just kind of jump right in. Rick, do you want to start or Ann?
I think Ann, I start, don't I?
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
All right, Rick, well, whenever you're ready, just jump right in.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. As Zach had mentioned, I'm Rick May. I'm an engineer working in the UAS integration office for the FAA. And I'm going to spend a few minutes this afternoon talking about the expansion of the Part 107 rule regarding operations over people and night operations. I can't get my, oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So the ops over people for the notice of proposed rulemaking, that was published back in February of 2019. And with that, we invite the public to comment on the rule, and we received about 1,000 comments on the proposed rule. From those comments, we review them, and we invite the public to put input on it. And sometimes those comments do provide some good insight, and we do adopt some of the comments that we got where it's feasible and it's a good idea. We'll talk a little bit more about that later too, which some of the comments did influence the rule that came out. The rule was just recently published January 15th, and it will be effective March 16th. So the expanded operations for Part 107, what we did is we created some categories of operations that will permit flying over people and also flying at night where you won't need a waiver to do this. One of the things that we got comments on and that we kind of adopted was we're also going to allow operations over moving vehicles. And we're updating the testing and training requirements to reflect the night operations, as that is one of the requirements to operate at night. So for the operations over people, we came up with 4 categories that we could do to allow the ops. First one, category 1, is a small UA, weighs about 0.55 pounds, 0.25 kilograms or less, and that's total weight. Also, no exposed rotating parts that could cause skin laceration. And there's also supposed to be no safety defects as well. Now, what's unique about the category 1 is that these are the responsibility of the RPIC. So the RPIC can go out and verify, yeah, it meets the weight requirement, doesn't have any exposed rotating parts, good to go, and you can go ahead and fly. There's no additional coordination needed with the FAA for category 1. And you also need, if you're going to fly over open air assembly, it requires remote identification to do that. Open air assembly is usually large gatherings of people, baseball games, concerts, crowded day at the beach, something like that. As mentioned, no need for the FAA approval. You can go ahead and fly. Ops category number 2. So this is where it gets a little interesting in that the FAA looked at it and said, you know, as long as your aircraft doesn't cause an injury equivalent to or greater than an injury resulting from an impact, kinetic energy 11 foot-pounds from a rigid object. That's the first requirement. No rigid object is used. So that'd you think of, you know, a rock or a, you know, solid piece of metal or something like that, where that rigid object, should it impact you, all of that energy is transferred into the human being. So that's why we specify the 11 foot-pounds from a rigid object. So you're assuming that 100% is transferred. Another requirement is you cannot have exposed rotating parts that cause laceration, similar to category 1. If you're going to fly over open air assemblies, you're required to have remote ID. And you're required to have a declaration of compliance to demonstrate that you're meeting an FAA approved method of compliance. And the manufacturers or the operators are responsible for meeting that method of compliance. But it's the RPIC who can go in, and we're intending so that they'll be able to go into the system, go online, and be able to check, is there approved DOC for that specific aircraft to make sure they're allowed to fly. So that's category 2. Category 3, here we looked at and we determined that we could increase that threshold of impact kinetic energy from 11 foot-pounds to 25 foot-pounds. Because we were able to increase the threshold, increase the severity, you have to decrease the likelihood to kind of even it out. So with that, for category 3, we do have an operating restriction, so that you have to fly over closed or restricted sites. Whereas closed restricted site, everybody within that site is aware that there could be a UA flying over them, and they acknowledge that. Or if you're not flying within a closed or restricted site, you're allowed to fly over the person, but it has to be transit only. So you're going from point A to point B. You can't hover over the human being, you can't circle over them, and you can't go back and forth. It's got to be just transiting directly over them. And then also for Cat 3, same thing, you're required to have a declaration of compliance, that you meet the FAA accepted means of compliance. So what's unique about category 2 and category 3, it's a performance-based requirement. So here, you notice we talked about the 11 foot-pounds and 25 foot-pounds from a rigid object. So if it turns out that you have a UA, which is not completely rigid, okay, the manufacturer can design it to account for frangibility, or the parts might break off, or that energy can be absorbed in other areas, and not all of it is going into the human being. It's kind of like when you think about the cars made from 1950s, right? When you got into an accident, those automobiles, all that energy would go into the, let's say, rear end of the car in front of it, and a lot of that would end up going to the passengers and hurting the passengers. And since then, cars have designed so that they have crash zones and parts of the car crumple, so that when there's an impact, that energy is dispersed out and it's put into the body or other areas, and it doesn't go directly to the human being. So this is the kind of the same concept where if you can come up with, and it could be a very large UA that weighs a lot, it can be, and can fly at high altitudes or fast speeds. But if you can account for, when you have an impact, that the same amount of energy that an 11 foot, that an object, a rigid object that has 11 foot-pounds is the same as this design, then you're okay. So you're kind of getting credit for coming up with the design that can deflect or absorb the energy. And as far as the means of compliance, right now, the FAA has one approved means of compliance for the impact energy equivalent, and that is a calculation of calculating your KE, which is 1/2 mass times velocity squared. So that is somewhat conservative because it does take into account that all of the energy is being transferred into the human. But if you can do that calculation, then you're good to go, if you meet the criteria using that. what we're really hoping for is going back to the bullets up above with the design of the aircraft, is that the OEMs or applicants will come up with methods of compliance that can demonstrate that you can meet these requirements of the 11 to 25 foot-pounds. So anybody can come up with an MOC and submit that to the FAA, and the FAA can review it and approve it. So what we're really hoping for right now is some of the industry and standards organizations, such as ASTM or SAE, can develop a standard for test method to go off and do impact testing for the UA to measure it, to see if you're meeting the specified thresholds or not. I know that ASTM is working on a test method right now with various methods to do that, and it's in work. So we're kind of hoping to have that done within the next six months or so. But also, there's no stopping if anybody can come up with a method they think's worthy and they want to submit it to the FAA. That's perfectly acceptable too. So we encourage that as well. And speaking for the MOCs, and as far as the lacerating the skin with the rotating parts, for that, basically, we'll say as long as you can look at it and see that there's no exposed rotating parts, then you're good to go with that. And then we're also looking for test methods for that as well to be used. So observer people category 4. So this is one of the things too that people came up with, some of the comments that we got from the NPRM. And people would ask, well, you know, okay, what if you have a certified aircraft, right? You got your airworthiness, you meet the reliability requirements, and you get your certification. What if you have that? Can't you fly over people with that? We said, yeah, that's a good point. So it turns out for your small UA, if you do go and get certified, get airworthiness certification for it, then you're allowed to fly over any people under any conditions and go from there. We do require maintenance inspection requirements for this, and we also require that you have remote ID if you are going to fly over open air assemblies for Cat 4. Operations over moving vehicles. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the items that from the comments, people came up and they're asking about this, and hey, why can't, FAA, why can't you do this? And we looked at it and we determined that, yeah, okay, this rule will allow ops over moving vehicles, but with some requirements. One is that the UA that's being operated has to meet categories 1 through 4 for operations over people, which you just mentioned. And you have to meet the following requirements: that you have to fly over a closed off restricted access site. Once again, where people who are in the site are aware that there will be UAs flying over their vehicles. And if the operation is not over a closed restricted access site, that the UA cannot maintain sustained flight over the moving vehicle. So once again, you can't hover, circle, or go back and forth over that. One point of interest is that here, moving vehicle, it does not include just automobiles. It includes trucks, motorcycles, boats, trains, just about any other vehicle out there that you can think of. Okay, night operations. So we were able to expand night operations. We were getting a lot of waivers from people who want to fly night ops. I think by far and away, this is the largest generator for waivers. So it was good for us to come up with something that could eliminate the need for a waiver to do this. And for night operations, it came with 2 requirements. One, the pilot has to take the updated knowledge test or training prior to conducting night operations. And 2, the small UA has to be equipped with an anti-collision light that can be seen from up to 3 nautical miles. And it has to have a flash rate that is sufficient to avoid collision. The flashing light is also, it's more for other aircraft to be able to see your aircraft, not so much for the operator to be able to see the aircraft that they're flying. A few other amendments that were put in for the Part 107 expansion. Allow pilots to take recurrent training online rather than having to go to a center and take it in person. And then also, if the remote pilot is questioned about things, they have to show their photo ID along with their certification to certain officials, including law enforcement, if needed. And a few dates. As mentioned, the federal rule was published on the Federal Register back January 15th. It was expected to be effective March 16th. We're hoping to get the training in place by early March so people can start going online and hopefully have that before the rule becomes effective. And then for the Category 2 and Category 3 operations, kind of given about a year out for that, around March 2022. And that's because we want to give time for industry or the standards development organizations to develop these test methods, which can become the methods of compliance that we can use. So we're hoping to do better than a year, but kind of that's what we're ballparking right now. And for me, that's it. So any questions or anything that I can address?
All right, we've actually had a ton of questions, so I was thinking about having them to the end here, but
that's fine.
On yours there, Rick. So we'll just address a few of them here if we can.
Sure.
So let's see. We'll start going through here. Does not contain any exposed or rotating parts that could lacerate human skin on impact. Does this mean exposed rotors are permitted so as long as they are stopped rotating prior to impact?
So as long as the rotors do not cause a skin laceration, then yeah, that's fine. But you have to prove that's not going to cause a skin laceration.
Sure. So if you had a parachute system, for instance, like Travis says here, that as soon as the parachute is deployed, it stops the motors. That meet the need, correct?
Yeah, so that when it makes the impact, the motors aren't turning, so that the prop is not sharp enough. So just by contact alone, it won't cause a laceration. Then yeah, I would assume that's okay.
Okay, perfect.
To have that.
And then let's see, we've got Nathaniel asked, will the night testing be part of online testing? I think yes, it will,
Yes.
as of March 1st. But again, we can't exercise that until March 16th.
Correct.
Correct. All right, let's see. So when we talk about Category 1, did Category 1 have a remote ID requirement that under 55 pounds or under 0.55 pounds?
I think it did, if you're going to fly over open air assemblies.
Over open air assemblies, but transitioning over people would be okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right, let's see. So someone studying for their 107, will these changes make their way into the initial knowledge test? Now, I know there's a kind of a gap between the recurrent and the initial and when that information will be there. Do we have any information on that?
I'll have to get back to you on that one. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know where they are with that right now.
All right, and all this training is available on FAAsafety.gov, correct?
The training that you need to take for this?
The recurrent training.
It's targeted to be, yeah.
Okay, sounds good. All right, and so someone asked if they just took the recurrent exam, will they be required to take an entire exam for night? So Albert, for that one, it's not an exam at that point. The recurrent is simply a training. So there's no exam, there's no need for a proctor. I know someone else had asked that one. So that's shouldn't be an issue. And then we've got another one. Will the online training be acceptable if someone passed 107 more than 2 years ago, but are not current now? And again, my understanding of that is it's still a valid certificate. You just need currency, and currency can be provided through that recurrent training.
Right.
Okay. All right. We'll dig through a few more here. So the parachute, so that one's answered. So if a manufacturer releases their DOC, their Declaration of Compliance, is there anything else the RPIC would need to do in order to tell the FAA that they're compliant?
No, the RPIC just has to go through and go to the site and check and make sure that the DOC's been posted and approved.
Okay.
And then they've gone through and done the checks so that, yeah, and then they're good to go.
And just to be clear, that DOC would only be valid if you have not changed anything on your aircraft. So I know that some folks add extra sensors, things like that. Is that correct, Rick?
That's correct. If you make significant changes to the aircraft, then that DOC is no longer applicable, and you'd have to reapply for that new configuration.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's see. So assuming they're all restricted to under 500 feet, it's 400 without a waiver. So that's not changing.
Correct.
All right, we got some people asking about what references the FAA will use for the night operations as far as the training around that. Is that just going to be the pilot's handbook, the same information that's in there?
I don't know. I'll have to get back to you on this, Zach, and if you want to distribute it out, you can.
Absolutely.
Right now, I'm not sure the content that's going to be,
okay,
or how they want to do that.
Okay. And another question we had here that I had actually. So a lot of folks use Lance, in the airspace where we got to get a little bit of permission to operate. Right now, at least, Lance and night flight are incompatible in that there's no Lance approval for night operations. What's the plan for that going forward?
They're gonna try and do it so that you can get your night ops through Lance, is my understanding. But there is some work involved, and they're working on that. I don't know if that's going to be ready by the effective date.
Okay.
But they are trying to come up with a system that can accommodate that need.
Sounds good. So our night waivers that are already out there, they're valid until I believe it's mid-May. So hopefully that will be addressed before the mid-May. Until then, make sure you still follow your night waivers and whatever provisions are a part of that. So
yeah, we recognize that Lance, it would be ideal to use Lance for that, and it's just how do you make that happen? So that's what we're looking at right now.
Very good, very good. So we got a question about, so won't the velocity vary with altitude of the aircraft?
Yeah, you have to, so there's with the kinetic energy, you basically look at two conditions. One is if you're cruising along, let's say you impact somebody at cruise speed or horizontal impact or at an angle. And it can also have a case where you are flying at a certain altitude and something happens and you start to fall. And in that case, yeah, the higher the altitude, then the higher the velocity will be when you impact the ground or human or whatever. So yeah, it is. Velocity is dependent on altitude when you're falling.
All right, so that's probably pointing more towards the parachutes that will keep that constant regardless of its altitude. So
you hope, yeah. And
then another question. So you talked about the MOC and DOC for manufacturers, and then the folks who home build, they would be qualified as the manufacturer at that point, would have to follow the same process as DJI or Autel or anybody else, correct?
Correct.
All right.
Right. So they would still have to submit to get an MOC, and that would be reviewed by the FAA. So then the FAA would have to approve that MOC. Then after the MOC is approved, they would still have to apply for declaration of compliance, referencing that approved MOC. So think of it as a two-step process. One, you have to have the MOC. Two, you get the DOC.
Perfect. And that actually answers the next question too. So let's take a moment real quick and let's transition over to Ann, so that way she gets time to really work through her stuff as well. So for those of you still answering questions, we will come back to Q&A at the end. So Ann, you want to go ahead and take it away there?
And I'm gonna stop sharing.
All right, then I will go pick up the baton and start sharing. Excellent. It started from my correct slide. So I'm here with you all today to talk about the remote ID rule, which is part 89, which is a new part for FAA. So remote ID, or RID, is the next step towards further integration of UAS into the National Airspace System. And what it really is it's a digital license plate rule. Remote ID is necessary to address aviation safety and security issues regarding operations in the National Airspace System. And it's an essential building block towards safety to allow more complex unmanned aircraft operations in the future. So much like Rick, the NPRM Notice of Proposed Rulemaking for the Remote ID Rule was published December 31st, 2019, which seems like a very, very long time ago. And it was open and available to the public for 60 days for comments. During that period, we received over 53,000 comments. And yes, we reviewed and read every single one of those comments and considered them when writing the final rule. So the final rule was published in the Federal Register on January 15th, same as the Office of People Rule, and it becomes effective 60 days after that publication date. So the main remote ID rule is Part 89, like I previously mentioned, but the rule also provides updates to other FAA regulations. It provides updates to parts 47 and 48 regarding registration, because remote ID requires you to register the serial number of your remote ID compliant UAS or your broadcast module. All the main operating requirements are under Part 89. And parts 91 and 107 have updates for ADS-B out and ATC transponder equipment. There are 3 ways pilots can comply and meet the requirements of the remote ID rule. So I'll talk about them a little more in the next slide. This is just a quick reference graphic to share with everyone. You can fly a standard remote ID drone. You could have a drone with a remote ID broadcast module, or you can fly in an FAA recognized identification area, also known as a FRIA, if you do not have a remote ID compliant drone. So here's a little bit more about the 3 different categories, and we'll start out with standard. Standard requires the UAS to broadcast message elements locally or over radio frequency. And message elements will include the unique ID, the serial number or session ID, the location of the UA, including the latitude, longitude, and altitude, the control station location with latitude, longitude, and altitude, velocity, time mark, and emergency status. And there are no operational limits other than the FAA current UAS operating rules that apply to your specific operation of whatever you're flying under with standard remote ID. Next up, we have remote ID broadcast modules, which is an option for home-built UAS or pre-existing UAS that you don't want to get rid of before it has its full lifetime of usage. You can retrofit with the broadcast module attached to the UAS, and it will broadcast the message elements. And this will include the serial number, time mark, the location of your UA, including latitude, longitude, and altitude, and your takeoff location. So for broadcast modules, the operator must install broadcast module and update registration information with the module serial number. And there are some operational limitations with the broadcast module. Operation must be within visual line of sight. And the third option is to fly in a FRIA. So this is where you fly if you're not equipped with remote ID, and when the final rule, the applicants for FRIAs are limited to community-based organizations and educational institutions. Within a FRIA, you can operate within visual line of sight only, and you must keep your operation inside the geographic boundaries of the FRIA. FRIA sites expire after 48 months, but they can be renewed. And FRIAs can be terminated by the FAA when necessary for safety and security reasons. Other things moving nearby that might negate the safety of the FRIA site when it was first approved. I'll dig in a little bit more to Homebuilt now. So Homebuilt is defined as a UAS built solely for education or recreation, and they must equip with remote ID broadcast module or fly in a FRIA. And the rule does clarify that producers of disassembled unmanned aircraft kits with all of the parts to build an UAS are required to comply with the manufacturing requirements, which means it's a standard remote ID. So here's a little bit more info about registration requirements for rec flyers flying under 44809. The final rule clarified that the owner can register once and apply their unique registration number to multiple UA, but in that registration, it must include the serial number of every single standard remote ID UAS or broadcast module flying with their registration number. And FAA is updating the registration website by around mid-March to ensure we have that capability. So single registration can have more than one UA serial number, but a serial number cannot be used for more than one registration. And the purpose of this is to enable law enforcement to connect the person to the unmanned aircraft without requesting information from the manufacturer. Again, just like a license plate. And here is the full rule schedule for remote ID. Final rule was published January 15th, and 60 days after that is March 16th. The UAS manufacturing and production compliance date is September 2022, and that's the same time that FAA also begins accepting free applications. And by September 2023, we expect all operators of UAS to be under full compliance with the remote ID regulations. Any questions? You're on mute, Zach.
My apologies. I have to do it at least once during every webinar because that's just the way things are these days. So got a couple of questions and I got a few people asking, would you be willing to share this slide deck with me so I can send it out along with the recording?
Sure.
All right. So for those of you asking about that, I'll send it out along with the recording once we get the recording posted up on the website. That'll be a part of that email there. So, going down here, so with FRIAs, you know, we have to keep within the geographical limitations. You know, when we talk about education institutions, you know, where we are an education institution here, would we apply for this and apply for it on the bounds of our grounds, or can it extend beyond that?
It kind of depends on the definition of what you want for your ground. Really, we want you flying solely within that FRIA. So if you want to operate outside of it, you should, in your application, have a larger FRIA.
Okay. All right. And so the applying to become a FRIA site, you said that September 16th, 2022, that those applications will start. Where do we go to start finding the information we need for that?
FAA is still actually working on the FRIA requirements. So by this summer, they plan to publish an advisory circular with more details for what we all need for a FRIA application and how to apply.
Great, great. So we've got questions about will there be a cost to the remote ID process? So I'm assuming that we do it in drone zone under our registration. Okay,
Correct.
so there wouldn't be an additional cost to go in and add that module on or the information for that module.
Yep, that's right.
All right. So just to clarify, an educational institution working under the recreational exception for education institutions can have one registration for multiple drones that are used?
I mean, any applicant can do that. It doesn't necessarily need to be for an educational purpose. You just need to make sure for your registration that you have the associated serial number for either the broadcast module or for every single remote ID compliant drone that you have in your fleet.
Okay, okay, great. Right, let's see. So Chris says, just to make sure I understand, starting September 16th, 2023, manufacturers must be in compliance with remote ID out of the box.
Correct.
All right. And then the RPIC will put in the serial number when they do their initial drone registration on Drone Zone there. Okay.
That's right. It should be pretty easy and pretty low effort for rec flyers to comply.
All right, great. So we got questions about the frequency. So I know that we're looking for community to come out with some of the standards around remote ID, but is there a designated frequency to be used?
No, not at this point.
Okay, so likely just one of the open FCC bands.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. And again, FAA will see more what comes in with the mocks that we get submitted by industry. So we'll know more once those start coming in to help develop our current and future drone policy and airspace policies.
All right, perfect. So we're relying on the folks out there making them to demonstrate compliance rather than the FAA going through and say, you must do X, Y, Z.
Exactly. That's the purpose of a performance-based rule.
Yes, yes, I like that. It gives options. So, let's see. So along with that, lost my train of thought. Okay, so with the remote ID and with the broadcast, all right. So we're broadcasting out this information. You know, the location of the control station, the location of the aircraft. Is there any restrictions on who can pick up that information, or is it just available to whoever has the ability to pick up the signal?
So the information that's being broadcast is not personally identifiable. So that will be broadcast publicly for anyone who is in the area and might have a transmitter. I don't really expect that many people to be doing that, but you never know.
Sure.
But the user and the pilot's privacy will still be protected.
Okay. And yeah, that was the next question there is, will our location and control station location be available publicly, or would they be private under that? So they'd be private, they wouldn't be able to just pick that out?
Those are public because it's not like your name or your address or your phone number. So that's the type of info that will be protected that only FAA has access to and can share with federal security partners or law enforcement as needed. But much like your current operations, if someone sees that you're out and flying, they know your location and where you're operating from.
Okay. So with the compliance on that, what is there a distance requirement for that broadcast? As in ideal conditions?
I don't recall what it is offhand. I know it's in the reg text.
Okay. All right, we'll have to take a brush through there and take a look. So I'm sure it's nothing crazy like a few miles or anything like that.
Oh no.
Okay. But I'm sure it's also not 5 feet. So it's going to be out there and it's going to be somewhat available. But you know, based on what Ann's saying here and what else I've heard, it's not like,
it's a pretty limited range.
Yeah, and likely if they can pick that up, they can probably see you too. Obviously, depending on where you're operating, but so. All right. So questions about will it be over what type of airwave? Again, it's not defined as far as the frequency, and it sounds like it's just going to be an RF broadcast, not a cellular network type thing, which is nice. I'm glad you folks got rid of the network requirement from the initial look at the rules there. And let's see, we already answered that one. Oh, here's a good one. What is the penalty for people who do not comply?
Ooh, that I do not know offhand. Our legal office and our security office would know that.
All
But
right.
we can look that up for you and get back to you on that.
Well, I say the easy answer for that is just go ahead and comply. Make it a nice, safe airspace for everybody to use, and we'll all get along. So when will the module be released? Again, that's up to individual manufacturers. Let's see. Does the FAA have a list of drones that already comply with the remote ID? I think that they'd have to actually show that they meet the standards. So has anybody submitted anything to show that they have met the standard?
No, we haven't actually started accepting mocks yet. So we currently do not have any FAA approved remote ID drones.
All right.
That's also starting this March.
All right. So somebody's got a question on whether or not a manufacturer will support it. It doesn't sound like necessarily, I mean, DJI or Autel could come out with a remote ID module to add on. There's also probably going to be a few other players who are not necessarily affiliated with a specific manufacturer, making some of these that are able to put on any aircraft. And so it doesn't sound like that's going to be a limitation for you. You're not going to turn your drone into an expensive brick, as one attendee asked. So.
No, in the development of the rule, they did a cost estimate for how much the broadcast module will be, and I think they estimated at a maximum of $50.
Okay, well, that's really not terrible when you're looking at, even some of the lower end stuff being over $1,000. That's a new set of props. So. So if a drone is built from a kit and does not have a serial number, can it be registered, and how would they go about that? What information would they use?
So if you want to register it for flying you could not register it and do so and just fly it in a FRIA. But if you want to be remote ID compliant and fly wherever you want to, not just limited to a FRIA, you have to get that broadcast module, and that will have the serial number.
All right.
So FAA just needs at least that to connect to your contact info, so we can identify who's flying in the air.
Perfect. So you'd use your serial number, and I'd assume you'd register your drone on Drone Zone the same way. You just simply use that remote ID serial number. Perfect. Okay. So as far as law enforcement getting the data, is there any kind of line they must meet, like a court order, anything like that, or is it just simply a request?
This is where we really need our security people on the line to walk us through the process. But from what I understand, if someone calls in a complaint about a drone flying or someone operating erratically or spying in their window, they contact their local FAA office and they will send out a LEAP agent to help investigate the case. And that is the person, the FAA employee, who will be getting the contact info and looking up the kind of serial number and who's actually operating that drone.
Okay, great. And let's see, will RID be required for drones under that half a pound mark, 0.55 pounds? Yes. No? Right. Ann, can you hear me?
Yep. Oh, yes.
Yes, they would. Okay. All right. And if I take the recurrency training, does that change my currency expiration date? Rick, that would be correct, right?
Yes.
All right.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Let's see. I'm just scrolling through the chat now, seeing if I can find any other questions here. So when operating in a FRIA, the regulations about flying over people still apply. That's simply a remote ID exception.
Correct. You can get waivers from the remote ID operational requirements. They do have waivable sections, but again, flying over people is an ops over people regulation and not a remote ID regulation. So you could technically request a waiver.
Okay. Okay. All right. So going back a little bit to Rick, when you were talking about ops over people, there was a few questions regarding prop guards versus a prop cage. So when we say that we've enclosed it, there's no exposed rotating parts. Now, generally, prop guards kind of sit underneath the props and go up to the line of the props, but it'd still be exposed on top, and we'd still consider that exposed, right?
Yeah, it would be exposed, but if you have prop guards on there, then you would not be able to lacerate the skin with those prop guards, right?
Okay.
So, yeah, I think when they mean exposed, I mean you can have the top side or bottom side exposed, but it's those those edges that can cause the cut, or they exposed. So, I think we consider prop guards to be okay. Yeah.
Okay. All right, sounds good. I'm not seeing any other questions here, so we'll give a minute. Anybody have any other questions that we didn't answer that I missed? It is absolutely possible. We've had some great help with Diane and Alina in the chat. Also, two other FAA representatives working the collegiate training initiative side with me. They've been going through and answering questions as they can. So if we missed anything, let's go ahead and try and post it now so we can let these folks get back to their very important jobs. Let's see. Someone asked if a FCC radio license will be necessary. I think, again, that's going to depend on the exact remote ID module from the manufacturer. Since the FAA did not define frequencies for it, it is a possibility that you could have an FCC radio license for some, depending on where it broadcasts. And I'm not seeing anything else here. So I want to take, again, oh, wait, here we go. Does the FAA expect someone to be able to design a Category 1 drone with remote ID, camera, gimbal, prop guards, and remain in the weight limits? Well, based on the fact that they put out the rule, I'd say yes. And I think actually, if you look at the Tello from DJI, I think it actually meets the requirements as it sits right now. With no remote ID on it, but as far as weight limit and all that other fun stuff, it does. Now, I'm sorry, refresh my memory there, Rick, with Category 1. They must be remote ID compliant for open air assemblies, but does that hold true for transitioning?
No, not for transitioning.
All right, so we can transition with something like a DJI Tello, as long as we've hit those other marks of the prop guards and everything else. We're
right. just avoid that open air assembly.
Yes. Okay. Great.
Good to go.
Perfect. And I did have another question, and so with Class 3, I know there's some interest around school stadiums and things like that. They're generally closed off. If we let people know as they come in and they accept that, would it be acceptable for Category 3 operations in that area? Now, my go-to is typically, yeah, you're probably not going to get anything that's worth flying over a area with a bunch of folks seated in it for a high school football game or something like that. But as far as legality and regulations, where would that sit?
So as far as the definition of the open air assembly, or would
so for Category 3 operations, so
okay.
Since with Category 3, if you're in a restricted environment and you let everybody know,
right,
that would fall under there as long as you meet the other requirements, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Let's see. Is it true that aircraft need a disabling feature if remote ID unit is not functioning?
So in the remote ID requirements, there is you must be able to like self-test before you take off once you start up the device. And if it's not functioning, then you can't fly unless you want to operate with it a FRIA.
All right, so it's not that necessarily the aircraft needs to have a disabling feature. It's you as a responsible pilot need to not fly with a non-functioning aircraft. All right, so there's questions on, and I don't know if you folks would be the ones to answer this, but there's interest in a wings type program like you have for manned pilots. Have you heard any rumors about that coming down the pipe?
I can't answer that. I'll have to defer to Ann if she might know something about it, but I have no idea.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything. We'll keep an ear out.
All right, sounds good. And of course, we'll let everybody know if we hear anything about that. So that'd be a great opportunity for additional training. And so let's see. So if the drone cannot connect with the remote ID network, will it be able to be flown? Well, there's no network, Phil. It's simply a broadcast module. So there's no need for an actual connection. Your drone must just transmit, and others would have the ability to receive it or not based on their location. So do we know if remote ID will be compatible with counter UAS systems like the Aeroscope?
That's still being worked out for the internal policy to see if it's interoperable or not. FAA is currently looking into that.
Right. So I think that's about the last one there. And I see Vic Moss has jumped in and answered a couple of questions too. Much appreciated, Vic. We always love having our folks that are educated and knowledgeable helping out in the chat, because there's only so many of us to go through those questions. So so I think at this moment we're coming up at the top of the hour. And let's see, the FAA safety team has considered a wings type program for UAS, but we're not sure on the current status. So it's been bandied about apparently, but no decisions yet. So that'd be something again that we'd love to see, I think. But so we'll take a second and I'll say, Ann and Rick, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to answer all these questions and to tell us about remote ID. I'll ask you to send over your presentation to me, and I'll make sure to get that out to the public here that's participating on this. I'd like to thank again Diana and Alina, and then also Vic Moss for stepping in and helping out in the chats there. And then of course our sponsors, the National Center for Autonomous Technology, Northland Community and Technical College, and then the FAA UAS CTI initiative. If you're looking for any information about those things, join our website. Take a look, lots of information there. This video will eventually be there, and that's ncatech.org. And we'll see you at our next one. Thanks again, everybody.